And I'll tell you a little bit about Lee. Lee has studied the history of the Yellowstone region for 40 years, so you're in very capable hands this evening. He is an expert on Yellowstone's vast literature and has contributed many of his own publications to that treasure trove. He is the author, co-author, or editor of 14 books, including Storytelling in Yellowstone, Horse and Buggy Tour Guides, Ho for the Wonderland, Traveler's Accounts of Yellowstone, 1872 to 1914 with Elizabeth Watry, and more than 25 journal articles. Whittlesey retired as park historian for the National Park Service in Yellowstone National Park on April 30th, 2018. He now lives in Livingston, so we're lucky. And he's working on his latest book, Stagecoaching Through Yellowstone, a 2-volume history. So with that, let's welcome Lee Whittlesey.
Thanks, Karen. Can everybody hear okay? Yep. Well, it's nice to be living in Livingston after all these years of planning to be here. As you know, Patricia Graybo never lets me forget that Livingston was the original gateway to Yellowstone. Even though it's 2 years younger than Gardner, it's still the original railroad gateway. So one of my books is called Gateway to Yellowstone. And it honors Livingston as well as Cinnabar, the little town that was right at the head of Yellowstone before Gardner got the railroad. And gosh, there's a footnote in there that explains that Livingston had 12 newspapers. Some of you guys who are local and really natives may not know that. I did not know that until I did that research. None of those newspapers, well, three's the most that ever were alive at once, but 12 newspapers is a lot. So we are fortunate to have, of course, a couple of them we don't have, unfortunately, but we're fortunate to have that kind of history here. And as someone who spent a whole lot of time reading those old newspapers, I have to say I can't wait for Karen's program about the bars and the brothels and the things that were on B Street, largely. You notice B Street today has a lot of parking areas. There used to be buildings. They weren't very good buildings, some of them, but that was B Street. It was an interesting place. So we'll see if I can make the clicker work to change the slides. And if not, Paul Shea says he will come up here and personally click them. By the way, I want to salute my friend Paul Shea because May the 5th is our 40th anniversary, Paul's and mine, of having been tour bus drivers together in Yellowstone. 1979. Uh-oh. And Paul was the guy who bought me drinks. Probably more than I should have. Okay, I want to talk to you tonight about a stagecoach tour. This is an actual later known as Yellowstone Western. This was the company owned by park photographer F.J. Haynes. This company was 1898 through 1916. During Stagecoach days, drivers quickly learned that their passengers were likely to ask questions because they wanted explanations about the strange wonderland features they were seeing while traveling through the park. While many drivers politely or even joyously consented to give tours by talking about the park, others were hesitant to talk to their audiences at all, or at least to answer all them fool Tenderfoot questions. A reference to the endless inquiries of tourists. The stagecoach companies were complicated in the park. There were 4 in-park companies and dozens of independents. The in-park companies were the Yellowstone Park Transportation Company, what I call YPT, the Oneida and Yellowstone Stagecoach Company, the Shaw and Powell Stagecoach Company, headquartered here in Livingston, and the Wiley Camping Company. These drivers, the drivers in the previous picture anyway, were YPT drivers, and they were the old-time, meaning the big coach drivers, as well as by old-time I mean they were old. These were guys, 7 or 8 of them that spent their entire lives driving stagecoaches. They all lived in Gardner. Many of them are in the Gardner Cemetery. We know their names. We have some of their photographs. There were 7 or 8 of them, as I say, and they were old when most stagecoach drivers were anywhere from 18 to 21. Many Yellowstone stagecoach drivers were noteworthy characters. Traveler Elbert Hubbard was a nationally known writer. Is it not going to do it? Well, was a nationally known writer. It's going to skip. It's going to jump. It's going to do all kinds of things that I don't know. There we go. The guy who wrote this, Elbert Hubbard, was a nationally known writer in 1914 when he penned this eloquent description of his driver that he met at the Gardner train station. As we walked out onto the platform to get a better look at this model station, thrill number 2 was thrown on the cosmic screen. 6 white horses attached to a great yellow stagecoach came swinging in on a rapid trot. The driver wore a $25 Stetson. A linen duster covered him from collar to heels. Double rows of big yellow buttons were on the duster. This was the only mark of livery. The hat was tilted at that self-confident angle which men of ability assume. The man wore gloves and handled his reins with an easy grace. His shoes were russet and matched the yellow buttons and the yellow of the stagecoach. The harness of the horses was bespangled with silver ornaments, and there was a multiplicity of ivory rings. The horses were as proud as the driver was. Like Hubbard, many visitors were ecstatic as they boarded the large park stagecoaches. Boarded the large park stagecoaches. Boarded the large park stagecoaches. Called tally-hoes, which carried travelers from the railhead to Mammoth Hot Springs. Here we climbed on top of a commodious, gaily colored coach, exclaimed a 1904 tourist, drawn by 6 prancing horses, matched teams of black, gray, and sorrel. Many visitors found their driver to be a fabulously interesting character, if not someone sitting next to darn near God himself. If the driver was special, the Yellowstone tour was just as special. In the 1880s, park visitors who patronized the stage lines, known then as tourists or dudes, tended to be formal and genteel, but that gave way to a lessening of formality by 1900. Visitors to Yellowstone National Park were from all states of the Union, and many other countries as well. They were of all ages, both genders, and largely upper class, although Yellowstone's evolving democracy would by the 1920s reach down to the middle class. According to a newspaper reporter who scrutinized the railroad platform in Livingston, Montana, the jumping off point for Yellowstone, of other countries represented, most tourists were from Great Britain or France, but there were also a fair number of Germans. These travel-stained travelers, and by the way, this article was in the Livingston Enterprise, were often a sight to behold. This reporter, who wrote for the Livingston Enterprise, as I say, was not impressed by weary-looking women with mussed attire and a general air of not having been to bed for several nights, a look almost anyone could get after that long on a train. He described the typical British traveler with his helmeted hat, knickers, and habit of saying things like, "beastly," or "I can't understand." He saw the harried man and wife with 3 children attached to her skirts, and here and there he observed will be seen the real thing, the dude with his 4-inch collar and a cane with a big knob, which he takes into the dining room of the hotel with him, as he would feel lonely without a companion of his own caliber. Most visitors came from the north by riding the trains of the Northern Pacific Railroad and disembarked at Cinnabar, 1883 to 1902, or at Gardner, Montana, 1903 to 1916. And remember, we're talking about stagecoach days here, not bus days. In these small towns, they bought souvenirs or saw the zoo at Cinnabar, which gave a hint of animals and other wonders to come. Then they boarded a 6-horse tally-ho coach and headed south from Cinnabar for the 8, or from Gardner, 5-mile trip to Mammoth Hot Springs. And there they would begin the 5-day counterclockwise tour around the park's narrow, dusty road system to Norris, Fountain, Old Faithful, West Thumb, Lake, Canyon, Norris, Mammoth, and back to the railhead at Cinnabar or Gardner. Tour guide G.L. Henderson described the scene at Cinnabar in 1885 in his newspaper Yellowstone Park Manual and Guide. And this picture, by the way, is one of the few we have taken the Cinnabar Depot. He said, "Wakefield and Hoffman's elegant coaches are waiting at Cinnabar to transport you to Mammoth Hot Springs in care of Adam Deem, who is the modern Adamic. Adamic? That's an adjective made out of his name, Adam. Guardian of all tourists, man or woman. His face gleams like the painted terraces. His heart is a perpetual geyser. He tucks, packs, straps, and stows your luggage with amazing rapidity. All right," he shouts, and away you go over hill and vale in absolute safety toward Wonderland. Here we see Wakefield and Hoffman, their stagecoach, arriving or departing at Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel, probably in 1884, before the Yellowstone wagons. So if you look at that strange stagecoach, it's strange in Yellowstone context because this is one of the old Plains boxy stagecoaches that were used in Yellowstone only for the years 1883 and 84. It's partly how we can date the photo. And in 1885 they were replaced by the Yellowstone wagons, groups of wagons manufactured in Concord, New Hampshire, where the seats all faced forward for touring purposes. In the old days, the old stagecoaches, they faced each other, and it was a boxy affair, and you couldn't really see the scenery. Between Gardner and Cinnabar, the visitor encountered his first taste of the all-pervasive dust that plagued Yellowstone's roads. Tour guide Henderson explained, when the season fairly opens in July and all the freight wagons and heavy Concord coaches are constantly passing over the roads, deep ruts are made by numberless wheels, and vast clouds of dust rise and hang suspended in the air when there are no air currents. When the wind blows, you either ride in your own dust and in that of the carriages behind you, or if there is a headwind, the dust is driven into your face with a force that blinds and maddens you. This picture taken in 1907. The dust was made continually worse by the hard, narrow wheels of stagecoaches that were constantly pulverizing roads into ever finer powder. Visitors who stepped out of coaches onto park roads routinely found themselves ankle deep in that fine dirt. On the way to Mammoth. On the way to Mammoth. Adam Deem and other stagecoach drivers would usually mention a strange castellated rock formation known as Eagle Nest Rock, where the tourist was apt to see the great American bird gyrating fondly around her nest. That the bird was often an osprey rather than an eagle meant little to most Yellowstone visitors. But one researcher has found that during the period 1900 to 1914, 35% of Yellowstone travelers' accounts mentioned Eagle Nest Rock, as opposed to around 0% today. Perhaps a patriotic indicator of the binding up of the nation's wounds to visitors and park employees who remembered all too vividly the recent unpleasantness known as the Civil War. Some of the drivers had actually fought in the Civil War. At Mammoth Hot Springs, the already dusty tourist would alight from his stage at the rambling National Hotel, often also called the Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel, 440 feet long and with an air of discomfort about the building, to spend his first night in the park. I kid you not, it was discomfort. After taking leisurely strolls to the nearby hot springs or purchasing a souvenir postal, also known as a postcard, at one of the curio shops, visitors could listen to or dance to the music of the hotel's orchestra that played most evenings, rendering excellent music, as one visitor wrote. Did I skip a photo jump? Nope. Come on. Please work. Well, we may have to enlist my friend Paul to change the slides. Uh-oh. There will be a slight interruption.
There we go.
Got the plug there too.
This. It's not obvious if there are manual controls here.
Right. Well, I know there are on the keyboard.
Oh.
It's the arrow down button.
Down?
If you do that, can you outside a touch? Wait, there you go.
There you go. How about if I point at you?
Yep, that'll work.
Anytime we need to change, okay? You mind?
No,
That would be great.
Can do three things at
Okay.
once.
Here's a photo of the orchestra and staff. Declared one 1904 visitor. On the ample porches, all the chairs were occupied and merry voices rang out at all times. This visitor was Clifford Allen, who loved his stay at Mammoth Hotel. Traveler Eva Keene Moger in 1896 found that the establishment was a fine hotel for such a place as Yellowstone, lighted throughout with electric lights, and it is nicely furnished. The hotel lobby included a photo stand where visitors could buy pictures of Yellowstone attractions. At Mammoth, the tourist could purchase a specimen to be coated with limestone by the hot springs while he was away in the park, sold by this man, Ole Anderson, at his nearby store, And here is yes, these are his coated specimens from his store on his shelf. You can see some of them he made and others he also made. Others he bought from some other place and had them coated, the little cannons. Some of these still exist, and but they're pretty rare, and boy are they expensive if you try to buy them today on eBay. Tourists could also descend into a cave called Devil's Kitchen, shown here, to see bats and formations, examine the hundreds of birds and insects killed by poisonous gas at Poison Spring, ponder the strange underground hot stream known as the River Styx, go for a swim at Bath Lake. After much searching, we found it at last, said one tourist. There was so much to do at Mammoth that the tourist was in danger of not having time for the obligatory walking tour of the Mammoth Hot Springs themselves. On the hotel's broad piazza, he found an interesting melange of people. There were travelers from all over the world. It's back one. Oh, one more. One more. One more. One more. One more.
Sure.
Back or forward?
Oh, forward.
Oh, you're saying back, so.
Sorry.
No worries.
There you go.
That one. There we go.
Yeah. There were travelers from all over the world, averaging at least 5 foreigners to 1 American, proclaimed visitor George Wingate. Engineers and army officers, railroad men and cowboys, travelers and stage drivers, all mingled on a footing of equality. This is a woodcut drawing of how the hotel lobby looked in 1884. Stage drivers, sometimes known as the Knights of the Silk, were romantic components of the Yellowstone picture. The following morning, they would line up their coaches, 4-horse ones this time, instead of the earlier 6-horse tally-ho coaches, lined them up in front of the hotel, ready to begin the continuation of the park tour. These coaches were called 4-in-hand coaches because drivers held 4 reins, one for each horse. One writer has characterized these departing tourist hordes as filled with a nameless exhilaration, everything especially beautiful, especially marvelous. Certainly there was a magic of sorts that permeated the air of Mammoth on these takeoff mornings, and it somehow fit with the atmosphere that many stage drivers had actually come to Yellowstone to be a part of the carefree summer life that Wonderland offered. And it still offers it today. As visitors met their drivers, they were delighted, horrified, or reconciled. Our driver combined the independence of America with the civility of Europe, declared an elated English woman in 1885. Company officers on the veranda shepherded passengers into groups for seating assignments. I give the pleasant people the most accommodating drivers, explained one official, and to the kickers, I give some crusty old frostbitten driver who will fire it right back at him. Abruptly, the stage drivers popped the silk, that is, cracked their whips, over their horses' heads and headed south. Notice here the mosquito netting covering the horses and the lady with the mosquito veil sitting on the box, as it was called, with the driver. On the box. They would pass Liberty Cap, the tall hot spring deposit that inevitably evoked comments and jokes about its phallic appearance. Give a mention of the Devil's Thumb, a smaller such deposit, swear at their horses, and then begin the 1,000-foot ascent of Snow Pass. Before 1885, the route took them past Narrow Gauge Terrace, past Orange Spring Mound, and steeply up Pinion Terrace through deep woods to a flat spot just north of what was called Jeweled Cave. There, drivers would rest the horses while visitors prowled south to the vertical opening of that cave, which many were understandably afraid to enter. I was when I visited it some years ago. After they clambered, that wonderful 19th century word that graced so many tourist accounts, clambered back aboard, drivers conveyed them to Snow Pass and across Swan Lake Flats. Beginning in 1885, an alternate route ran south from Mammoth through the limestone hoodoos and ascended Golden Gate Canyon via Kingman Pass. Here, the driver would generally tell his passengers about the $14,000, a great deal of money then, that Lieutenant Dan Kingman of the U.S. Corps of Engineers had expended to build the road. Passengers would get out to walk so that the coach could cross the rickety Golden Gate Bridge empty. They were obeying in spirit the sign on the bridge which read, "Walk your horses." You can see the sign there, just to the right of the soldier sort of standing at attention. The first Golden Gate Bridge was rickety and made of wood. Stagecoach passengers had to disembark and walk over it as the horses in the coach slowly clattered along behind them. Passing Obsidian Cliff, the driver could be depended upon to mention that it was an arrowhead quarry site for many western Indian tribes, to describe how the road was built here using huge fires to heat the obsidian. "The only glass road in the world," would say some drivers. And possibly to tell a fake Jim Bridger story about seeing an elk telescopically reflected in the crystal of the mountain. At Frying Pan Spring, shown here, where visitors could usually smell the rotten egg stench of hydrogen sulfide gas bubbling through water, the driver often did not explain that the gas made these springs appear hotter than they were. Instead, he might tell his passengers that the forest was full of boiled eggs, because after the birds there drank the water, the next eggs they laid were hard. Today, visiting this spot requires a little bit of a walk because they've moved the road. Passing Hazel Lake, stage drivers began the pull up a hill above Norris Geyser Basin, and then a long drop down to the Gibbon River where the horses would clip-clop across a wooden bridge and find their way to the lunch station. Located south of the soldier station and across the river at today's large pullout, where some of you might remember there used to be a payphone. This place was Larry's lunch station from 1893 through 1901, when the genial Irishman Larry Matthews ran it. Larry's banter to his guests, along with his always entertaining stories, and his 5-year-old daughter, at least she was 5 early in the period, were a part of the park tour that became well known, and entertaining he was. Larry's job every day was to be funny from 11 to 2 o'clock, during which time he must not only amuse the inbound tourists, but carefully avoid repeating himself to those outbound travelers who were lunching here for the second time. "In with ye's all and register," Larry would say in his Irish brogue as he welcomed the stagecoaches. A lady asked for a glass of milk, so Larry would shout, "Drive in the cow!" "A drink of water, if you please," mumbled a pretty girl, and Larry, with pretended solicitude, would answer, "Would ye like it hot or cold?" A standard comment was Larry's loud announcement to all of his guests, "There's no extra charge for flies and dust, always on the bill of fare." In 1901, Larry Matthews became the first manager of the new Norris Lunch Station, located on the north side of the Geyser Basin proper, and from 1902 through 1904, Larry managed the Old Faithful Lunch Station, and then he was the first manager of the newly built Old Faithful Inn. "Good luck go with Larry," declared writer Rudyard Kipling, who liked Larry even if he liked little else in Yellowstone. Kipling was a fussy and difficult tourist. Should you ever read his account from sea to sea. After lunch, a tour guide hired by the Yellowstone Park Association would generally walk the visitors through Norris Geyser Basin, where they would see constant geysers, shown here. Eventually, the walking guide would shepherd visitors to a stagecoach loading platform at Minute Geyser. There, travelers would reboard their coaches for the afternoon trip to Fountain Hotel, a hot, dusty, and generally boring ride through long stretches of timber. Prior to about 1891, visitors like Theodore Jerish experienced Gibbon Falls, an 84-foot waterfall on Gibbon River, from its east side, not the west as we see it today, by a difficult scramble down an unimproved slope to a dangerous view for tourists. Then it was south through more timber for these tourists, the monotony relieved somewhat by Teton Hill, a place where guests could see the rising steam plumes of Lower Geyser Basin and the Grand Teton Mountains at a long distance away. Probably don't need it, but at Fountain Hotel, which replaced another hotel in 1891, the evening's entertainment generally consisted of a trip to a bear feeding area at the garbage dump behind the hotel. Superintendent S.B.M. Young was told about it as soon as he arrived in 1897 and routinely told visitors to go over to the Fountain Hotel and there you will see as many bears as you wish. Dan Beard, who started the Boy Scouts of America, noted that bears began to appear merely at the sound of the Fountain garbage wagon as it rumbled to the dump. Hotel bellman taught visitors to feed sugar cubes to bears gathered there, and the Fountain Bear feeding area became famous and continued through 1916 when the hotel was closed. The third day in the park involved a trip to Old Faithful. Stagecoach drivers reined their coaches up to the Fountain Hotel and loaded passengers in preparation for heading south. A few minutes later, they would swing into the nearby Mammoth paint pots, today's fountain paint pot, so that tourists could have a view of the colorful, hot, bubbling mud there and the well-known Fountain Geyser that erupted 60 feet high. A 1908 visitor gushed that Fountain Geyser was a cloudburst of rarest jewels which seemed suddenly to crystallize into a million radiant forms as it sprayed out into the sunlight, a glittering mass of diamonds, moonstones, pearls, and opals, dancing like fairies far above our heads. Ah, they could write in the 19th century. It was here at Lower Geyser Basin that visitors first encountered the lovely alkaline hot springs and geysers for which Yellowstone was justly celebrated. At Norris, he had seen the less lovely acidic springs. Some people thought they were downright ugly. And at Mammoth, he had seen beautiful springs but without spouting geysers. At Lower Basin, it became apparent why Yellowstone was famous. For the hot springs and geysers here were colorful, deep, clear, dramatic, and exquisite. Its colors danced through the waters in each vibration. High and 300 feet wide. Think about that. Which raised the water level of Firehole River nearly a foot. Even if they could not see it erupt, they could marvel over its 300-foot wide crater and 20-foot high towering walls that surely were the same as looking down into hell, as well as its beautiful deep blue boiling water which was discharged into the river at thousands of gallons per second. Sometimes called the Sheridan Geyser for the legendary General Philip Sheridan, who visited it in 1881 and 82. Excelsior Geyser was, according to one writer, a remarkable hot water fountain. Why, to sit on the edge of hell's half-acre, he wrote, and watch the Sheridan Geyser is to have a lifetime memory. It is twice as big as this hotel, he wrote from the Metropolitan. And the steam and water ascend to a height of 400 feet. It is indescribably grand to watch it first sending up a cloud of steam, then water, higher and higher, until the stupendous magnitude of a full eruption is reached. Mrs. E.H. Corbett actually saw an eruption of Excelsior in 1888. We all stood on the brink and watched the water begin to bubble in different places, she noted. Then the center became more and more agitated, and the geyser rose, first quite small, then higher and higher, until we had to fly from the torrent of water and stones that were thrown hundreds of feet high and many yards over its edge. She finished her observations by regretting that one gentleman was badly hit by a stone. Viewing geysers could be dangerous in those days and before boardwalks. And this picture, actually taken in 1888 by F.J. Haynes. Then for the tourist, it was on for 5 miles past the exquisite Morning Glory Pool and Castle Geyser to Old Faithful. Morning Glory Pool was, get this, a diaphanous cup full of limpid sky. Of the clearest, loveliest, clearest robin's egg blue. And that's really not that far off if you saw it in its heyday. Said one tourist, while Castle Geyser's cone resembled a ruined castle or tower, Castle would occasionally erupt 100 feet tall, and postcard views that one could buy at curio shops showed visitors standing on top of its cone, an activity that is no longer allowed today. Mrs. Townsend stated that in 1906 their walking guide took them up onto the cone. What a treat. And an 1887 party that climbed to its top was drenched when the geyser erupted. At Old Faithful, one could easily take a full day to see the many large geysers and hot springs, and after 1904, Old Faithful Inn. But half a day was all that was allowed. This failure to allow extra time for the stop was the greatest source of complaints during Stagecoach days. It was fixed later. Here, tourists would be lodged, depending upon the year, at the Basin's Shack Hotel, 1885 to 1894, at a series of ramshackle tents operated by the Yellowstone Park Association, 1894 to 1903, at Wiley Camping Company's tents, 1883 to 1916, at Old Faithful Inn, 1904 to 1916, or next to one's own campfire if you camped out. Old Faithful Inn, which opened in 1904, immediately captivated the already amazed visitor. Built entirely of logs, the 140-room hotel was at once unique and stunningly beautiful, especially with stagecoaches and horses in front of it. A lofty, wide-spreading structure with a touch of Swiss about its gables and windows, it somehow fit perfectly with its surroundings. According to one 1904 visitor, it exhibited a startling oddness which one learns to adore. Hard to disagree with that. While another visitor called it the craftsman's dream realized, the local newspaper, The Enterprise, proclaimed it the largest log structure in the world and noted that hundreds of miles of forest were searched for gnarled and twisted branches and trunks of trees. It was my ambition, stated the inn's architect Robert Reamer, to construct a building without a piece of planed wood in it. In all, the big structure, there is not a foot of smooth finished board or molding. Old Faithful Inn remains today an iconic cultural wonder for Yellowstone in the midst of great natural wonders. If Old Faithful Village was the place of premier wonders, Old Faithful Geyser, then as now, was the most sought-after individual feature for a look. When I invest my money in geysers, said one stagecoach driver, I'll take Old Faithful every time. Why, if it weren't for him, there'd be no park. The whole thing would be a fraud. Notwithstanding that incorrect assessment, there were many other things to see. Early hotel visitors reported that people ran screaming in mass from the lobby when told that the Beehive Geyser is playing. Like today, the hotel sometimes made announcements of the warning spurts of Beehive's indicator, a small geyser nearby that gave notice of its neighbor's bigger eruptions as imminent. A watchman on the lookout shouts, the Beehive, wrote 1885 visitor Edward Marston, and people rush out of their beds wrapped up in blankets or whatever clothing they can find, and off they go. Can you imagine that? The Giantess Geyser, with its 100-foot jets that forced their way through a 60-foot dome of water, caused one visitor to confide to her companion, I'm going to reform. The Grand Geyser, a 200-footer that had many separate bursts, was one that visitors wished hard to see. We heard the shouting of the park guides, the Grand, wrote 1883 visitor Henry Reynolds. The splendid Daisy Grotto and Riverside geysers were all there too, and all could entertain. Yes, at Old Faithful, the atmosphere was at times downright festive. Hundreds of tourists are to be seen here all day long, exulted Robert McGonigal in 1900. And judging by the multitude around you, it is not difficult to imagine oneself at a circus or a country fair. The place was indeed busy, as journalist Ray Stannard Baker noted in 1903. He described park tent camps as buzzing with visitors, everyone in ecstasies over the geysers, setting up cameras, snapping buttons, filling little bottles with hot water or little boxes with pink mud, all very jolly, all expecting to be astonished, and all realizing their expectations. H.W. Hutton, an 1881 traveler who camped along the way, as everyone did then, encountered a kind of democracy among visitors in the Old Faithful area. This traveler, at Giant Geyser, shown here, provided one of the only looks at class structure in early Yellowstone when he recorded his approval of the democratic atmosphere. It is here, he wrote, that you meet presidents, professors of colleges, teachers, preachers, army officers, government outfits, statesmen and grandees, lords, barons, and noblemen. And yet all seem to be on an equality. One does not think himself above another. All are pleasant and communicative. They are seeking rest from the busy cares of life and also to satisfy their curiosity in beholding these great wonders of the world. There were wonderful stories for visitors to hear and guides to tell at Old Faithful. One involved the Devil's Ear, a hot spring that was ear-shaped, where his satanic majesty below could hear messages from the surface. Another involved Chinaman's Spring. Park tour guides told this Chinese laundry story so often that it nearly assumed fairy tale status in Yellowstone. An Asian laundryman erected a tent over a hot spring on the river just north of Old Faithful in 1885 and shown here duly. Perhaps from the soap he used, the spring erupted one day, tossing the Chinaman's tents and its contents into disarray. Later versions of the story added fictional details, such as having the laundryman thrown all the way to the streets of Shanghai. Even the Police Gazette picked it up and claimed that 4 or 5 Chinese had been killed as that happened. I have the issue of the Police Gazette from way back then, but it wasn't true. At Old Faithful, the wandering visitor might even run into G.L. Henderson, this man, the illustrious old-time park storyteller who worked at the Wonderland post office there, and hear one of his grand tales from the past. All of these stories became part of the lore of the Old Faithful area and Yellowstone as a whole. And if you find a postal souvenir with the Wonderland post office postmarked on it, please give me a call. It seemed there was never enough time at Old Faithful. The visitor could dig specimens at Specimen Lake, no longer permitted. Or marvel at the elaborate formations of the Devil's Punch Bowl, shown here in Haynes's beautiful 1908 postcard. Beginning in 1904, he could opine about the strangely knotted wood in the Old Faithful Inn, and shortly after that, do the same at the Claimer Store, today's Lower Yellowstone General Store. Beginning in that same year and until 1948, a searchlight, sometimes colored, on top of the inn, lit night eruptions of Old Faithful Geyser. If all this were not enough, there were Surrey side trips that could be made to Lone Star Geyser, 3 miles to the south, or to Black Sand Basin, 1 mile west, where 2 of the park's most famous hot springs could be viewed, Emerald Pool and Handkerchief Pool, shown here, lower right, with a handkerchief floating in it. In particular, Emerald Pool, I love this, was depicted as just the kind of place where fairies might reside, as you can see in that beautiful drawing at the right. That gets us riders. Geyser baths. Beginning in 1914, the tourist at Old Faithful could swim in the Geyser Baths swimming pool, but he would probably never see dozens of smaller wonders such as the Witch's Cauldron, the Lime-Killed Springs, the Seashell, Solitary Geyser, or the Petrified Deer Tracks, because these and many more were generally found only by park employees, like my friend Tom Venable sitting out there, my friend Andy Fisher sitting out there, my friend George Gorneman sitting out there, my friend Melissa McAdams sitting out there, and others, who had an entire summer to discover them. Old Faithful was a strange and fascinating place. And one could wander across a footbridge to Grand Geyser on the opposite side of Firehole River, or linger on the gnarled bridge near Old Faithful Inn, a bridge that seemed to have sprung from Alice in Wonderland, festooned with strange mushrooms. And a bigger version. This photo with the children on the bridge, taken about 1910. From Old Faithful, the drivers would convey their passengers east toward lake and canyon. The new 1892 road from Old Faithful ran up Spring Creek Canyon and was not the same as today's road until it began its ascent of Craig Pass. These 1896 visitors, like today's tourists, were enthralled with the idea that Isa Lake drained to both oceans backwards. It is indeed wonderful to think that this little lake, perched up some 8,000 feet, wrote one Yellowstone visitor, should be the commencement of such rivers as the Missouri-Mississippi system and also the Columbia. Next on the tour came West Thumb, an area that was little visited until 1892, when the new road from Old Faithful opened, and Larry Matthews was sent over there to run this lunch station. That summer, West Thumb received a lunch station, this one, that quickly became a small hotel, and almost immediately lunch station employees began offering walking tours of the geysers there for incoming stage passengers. The hot spring known as Fishing Cone, already proclaimed wondrous by the 1870 Washburn Party, became even more famous as park visitors scurried to see it in droves. It is quite true, marveled an 1884 tourist at the site, that you can catch a fish and boil it on the hook without moving from the spot you are standing on. Originally, visitors did not believe this claim, but by 1903, Fishing Cone had become famous, and this picture helped make it famous. Larry Matthews, standing on Fishing Cone, fishing in a cook's hat and apron. Down at the lake brink, reported journalist Ray Baker, a number of girls are trying with unaccustomed fishing rods to perform the feat without which no visit to the park would be quite successful, catching a trout and cooking it, wriggling in the hot pool behind them. But boat trips, of course, would happen via the steamship Zilla. They were also available then, beginning in really 1889. And for some years in the 1890s, boat operator E.C. Waters paid a kickback to stage drivers of 50 cents per passenger to convince tourists to ride his boat. But one day in 1899, when Mr. Waters was away from the park, Mrs. Waters decided not to do this, and so the drivers boycotted her and the boat. Holding a meeting at Lake, they appointed one of their own to demand money from Mrs. Waters for the people they'd put on the boat. When Mrs. Waters refused until her husband could return, the angry drivers wired Fountain Hotel and other drivers, and as a result, the Zilla carried few or no passengers for weeks. On arriving at West Thumb, drivers made statements about the steamer to get even. Statements such as, "You know the boat's not safe. You know the boat has sunk once. You know the prices of the boat company really are pretty darn high. You know lightning is really liable to strike that boat while you're out there. You know there's really not a lot to see from that steamer. And what are you going to miss? You miss the finest drive in the park if you take that steamer." All of these statements were false, and they were a part of what Mr. Waters perceived as attempts by the hotel company and two transportation companies to hurt his boat business. When he returned to the park, he restored the 50 cents per passenger to the drivers, plus payment for all back passengers. It was probably the last nice thing that E.C. Waters did for anyone. Regardless of the boycott and alleged attempts to scuttle Mr. Waters' boat business, most Stagecoach passengers did take the boat cruise at West Thumb rather than ride with the stage driver on land, around in the boring Deadhead over to Lake Hotel. Deadhead, that's where the coach goes empty. They still use that term in buses and truck driving. Somehow, cool breezes in their faces, a temporary escape from mosquitoes, and the opportunity to see these animals in pens on Dot Island were preferable to continued dust and heat by land, even when the coach trip was supplemented by a drive through the oddly knotted woods near Natural Bridge. Thus, because their boat landed at Lake Hotel, many visitors missed the Natural Bridge, a secondary wonder in Yellowstone that would have been the entire reason for a park in many places. An 1884 traveler did see it, however, commenting upon the handiwork on its summit, completed by Park Superintendent Norris, Mr. Norris. "There were railings put up to prevent unwary travelers from falling over," he wrote, "and the bridle path across its top was wide enough for a carriage to cross it." Visitors who went to Yellowstone Lake before its hotel opened in 1891 found terrible accommodations. Really rough tents. All of that changed when the Lake Hotel opened for business. Its architecture, commented on by many visitors, was unusual for a wilderness setting. "The entrance, with its wide porch and massive high columns," exclaimed a 1904 visitor, "is not unlike the entrance to the White House." This visitor had just seen the massive renovation by architect Robert Reamer and was enthralled by the hotel's colonial styling, which remained a feature of its appearance 100 years later. At Lake Hotel, after a dinner served with wildflowers gracing the tables, they don't do that anymore. Visitors could take quiet strolls along the beach, watch bears feeding in a garbage dump behind the hotel, rent boats to go fishing for prized cutthroat trout that inhabited Yellowstone Lake, or simply soak up the atmosphere by looking out on the lake and feeling its breezes. The winds that sweep across the silver lake of Yellowstone, quipped Myra Emmons romantically in 1901, bite and thrill like a first kiss. Yeah, you gotta love that. The lake area could make visitors feel almost religious in their outlook, and that was good practice for the upcoming Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. One visitor seemed to whisper in reverence his appreciation for the twilight hours at Yellowstone Lake. "Then the soft gloaming," he intoned, "with the spectacle of the dying lights of day playing about the crests and pinnacles of the still and solemn upper realm of the sleeping mountains on the opposite side of the lake. Just kidding. Created a contrast that offered a text for talk. It seemed that, yes, conversation was indeed one of the quiet things visitors could enjoy at Lake Hotel. The morning of the 5th day saw travelers preparing to see Hayden Valley and the Great Yellowstone Canyon. After passing Fishing Bridge and traveling for miles along the forested Yellowstone River, tourists arrived at Mud Geyser, Mud Volcano, and Dragon's Mouth Spring. This locale remains a smelly place today. Its air strongly impregnated with hydrogen sulfide gas, but early visitors found it fascinating. Mud Geyser erupted 40 feet high in the 1870s, but ceased by 1905. Mud Volcano threw mud into the tops of trees in 1872, but it too settled down into the role of quiet churning by the following year. The tongue-like lashing hot water action of Dragon's Mouth Spring was responsible for its carrying many different names, including Gothic Grotto, Devil's Workshop, Belching Spring, and 14 more that we can document. Mud Volcano was a sort of cave like the lair of a wild beast, shuddered one visitor, which perpetually vomits a compound of mud, putty, and nastiness. Said another visitor about Dragon's Mouth, the angry dash of rock-bound waves roars within, while a continual jarring, similar to that made by a powerful engine and heavy machinery, is heard, accompanied by a rush of scalding steam from the portal. The portal. One could almost feel it from that description. As stagecoaches conveyed visitors into Hayden Valley, drivers geared up to tell news stories. And going into Hayden Valley meant I had to use this fabulous, rare, colored postcard from about 1908 or so of that lady. The crossing of Alum Creek almost certainly guaranteed that a driver would dust off his Jim Bridger tale about the puckering waters of the creek. One version had it that the waters of Alum Creek, when sprinkled on park roads, shortened the distances between points, probably appealing to visitors who wished for an end to certain long stretches of road. Our voracious driver said that when it was forded, it sometimes shrank a 4-horse team down to a pair of mules passing through the water. Sniffed 1904 visitor Clifford Allen, who, needless to say, did not believe the driver's story. And it was, after all, not a true Jim Bridger tale, but rather a stage driver creation. Wonder of wonders. The story reportedly fell into disuse when a lady visitor suggested to one stagecoach driver that if the water were so good for shrinking things, perhaps he should soak his head in it. This stretch of road followed the tranquil Yellowstone River, and tourist Moses Thatcher reveled in his time spent there. He also described the river in the canyon, with its subterranean mutterings, silent flow, rushing cataracts, rock-bound shores, foaming falls, magnificent curves, restful banks, craggy heights, and mighty depths. He exulted. How like the flow of time is this king of mountain streams. This man expended column after column in describing the river and its canyon. And many other observers did the same, as stage tourists attempted to discuss the sublimity of Yellowstone River, its 2 big waterfalls, and its magnificent canyon. For many travelers, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone was the piece de resistance of the park, and many commented on how appropriate it was that the counterclockwise park tour seemed to save its best trip for last. Olin Wheeler, historian for the Northern Pacific Railroad and a visitor of more than ordinary importance, summed up in 1906 what most visitors thought of it. The canyon, he enthused, was the acme of grandeur found here. 20 miles in length, 1,200 feet deep, 2,000 feet wide. No one can stand before its chaste glories unmoved, It thrills, inspires, awes, and overwhelms. It alone is enough, were all else gone from the park, to make it the wonderland of the world. In this description, Wheeler was half right, for the canyon was 4,000 feet wide in places. It was true that for most visitors, the canyon was the be-all and end-all, the star of the Yellowstone tour. Perhaps the most famous of the many descriptions of it, published and republished over time, was one by 19th century preacher Wayland Hoyt. His description was remarkably free of religion for a preacher, but it was eloquent, widely quoted, and personal. He said, "The whole gorge flames. It is as though rainbows had fallen out of the sky and hung themselves like glorious banners. It is impossible that even the pencil of an artist can tell it. It is as if the most glorious sunset you ever saw had been caught and held there. Through nearly all the hours of that afternoon, I waited there, clinging to that rock, jutting out into that overpowering, gorgeous chasm. I was appalled and fascinated, afraid and yet compelled to cling there. It was an epic in my life." There were others who waxed eloquent about the canyon as well, dozens of them. "Here is where the wonders of the Yellowstone receive their crown of glory," stated one. "How does one paint such a vision?" questioned another, "where relatives, proportions, lights, shades, tints, and finally perspective are absolutely unmanageable." 1896 traveler Eva Keene said the canyon's beauty made her want to cry and to never leave it. Charles Stoddard could think of nothing to compare it with except perhaps some imaginary chasm in the planet Saturn, and of eagles nursing their back door of the Canyon Hotel, but one historian says it was there. And well, it could have been, because the canyon area was loaded with bears. The bear feeding area at Canyon was the hotel garbage dump, located about 300 yards west of the hotel in a narrow, shallow valley near the edge of the forest. It was a place where everyone went, like all the other locations, for entertainment. The account of several ladies who went there after dinner in 1902, they returned with glowing accounts of numerous silver tips, which were almost as dangerous as grizzlies and nearly as big. Well, that account illustrates the lack of information most visitors had about animals, for silver tips and grizzlies were the same bears. And what animals did the Yellowstone tourists look for and hope to see? Bears were most sought after, of course, but elk, deer, antelope, today called pronghorn, were also mentioned in various accounts. Bison were seldom seen until 1896, when tourists could encounter them in a pen on Dot Island. But they had been in the park in great numbers as victims of the 12-year commercial slaughter that also inflicted itself on southern Montana. Indeed, central Montana and northern Montana. A whole lot of those animals went out on the steamboats at Fort Benton, headed for the East Coast. Dead animals, of course. And a whole lot of others went out on the Yellowstone River steamboats. Little known that the steamboats came up the Yellowstone River until beginning in 1877, when the river was high enough to take these animal carcasses, skins, robes, skins, hides, and furs, they called them, downstream and off to the east coast. Visitors loved seeing animals, but in the 1880s, animals were not seen as frequently as today because of this very massive commercial slaughter that occurred 1871 through 1884. At Canyon, the following morning, Stagecoach visitors headed west across, at least initially, an ocean of cut stumps to Norris and back to Mammoth Hot Springs, lunching with Larry Matthews again and viewing scenery that they had seen earlier. This fifth day of the Yellowstone tour was often a time of singing on the stagecoach and shouting greetings to people riding stagecoaches in the opposite direction. Indiana, or we're from Ohio. And sometimes they had their own little songlets and poetries that they had prepared for the other stagecoach visitors coming at them. Visitors sang songs while their stagecoaches were headed downhill with a vengeance, the road dropping 1,000 feet in 5 miles from Swan Lake Flats to Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel. After dinner there, or at a tent camp, if you were with one of the camp's companies, the outbound tourist rode the stage to Cinnabar or Gardner, where he boarded the train for return to the main Northern Pacific line at Livingston, Montana. Thus, his Yellowstone tour became history. How did visitors react to that Yellowstone tour? Most were not like Rudyard Kipling or Mrs. Corbett, who did not like anything they encountered in the national park. Many were short in their summary comments, such as T.S. Kinderdine, who said only that its eruptive wonders, its mountain scenery, its falls, lakes, and streams, and its untamed wildernesses will be forever held in our memories. At least one visitor was glad to leave because he was overwhelmed. Strange to say, you feel a sense of relief on leaving the wonderful park, wrote W.B. in 1886. Your mind is kept on such a stretch and strain of admiration at the wonderful treasures of art that you're glad to get away from them. He longed to rest his eyes on objects more mundane and less interesting. And he was soon to have it when he hit the train and the plains outside of Montana. In general, most visitors loved Yellowstone. Raymond H. Barker said of it, "Farewell to the Yellowstone. Its canyons are the grandest, its waterfalls the fairest, its geysers the most marvelous, and its flowers the most varied and beautiful." But few visitors were as eloquent as artist Frederick Remington, who declared, "Americans have a national treasure in the Yellowstone Park, and they should guard it jealously. Nature has made her wildest patterns here, has brought the boiling waters from her greatest depths to the peaks, which bear eternal snow, and set her masterpiece with pools like jewels. Let us respect her moods, and let the beasts she nurtures in her bosom live. And when the man from Oshkosh writes his name with a blue pencil on her sacred face, let him spend 6 months where the scenery is circumscribed and artificial." By golly, thank you, Frederick. Thus, by the mid-1880s, as I've described here, the evolving embryonic travel entity in Yellowstone, composed of hotels, transportation companies, stagecoach drivers, and even some walking guides, had established an elaborate framework to convey park information to visitors. Yes, even back then. Stagecoach drivers from 4 different companies and dozens of independent stage drivers and coaches reined their teams through Yellowstone on a frying pan-shaped road system and told stories to tourists who were often eager to ask all them fool tenderfoot questions. As early as 1885, Yellowstone had become famous. G.L. Henderson effervesced as follows about it. Nearly 4,000 square miles have been set apart and consecrated, no less, to the highest human uses. Every railroad aims to be the medium by which to reach it. Every American must see it once before he dies. All the world dreams of it and reads about it. The best artists photograph it, copy it, and paint it. Men renew their youth in it, and women become more beautiful from having breathed its air and inhaled the perfume of its flowers. Boys become wiser, and girls lovelier for having visited fairyland. Well, perhaps he exaggerated a bit, but to those of us who have spent a while there, it does not seem like that great of a stretch. It is, after all, Yellowstone, the first national park in the world, cornerstone of conservation history, icon of wilderness preservation, linchpin of early tourist travel in the American West, and a member of the first family of mythical places. Thank you. We can take questions if you have any, and we'll give you the microphone. Any questions?
I'm curious about injuries and fatalities.
Yeah. Uh-oh. You opened a big one on that one. Wildlife show is our equivalent today to those old bear feeding grounds. Of course, we don't feed garbage to bears anymore. But I say we, they, those guys out there, the rangers, I'm retired. They don't feed garbage to bears anymore. But the great equivalent is the Serengeti of the Lamar, in my opinion. The American Serengeti, they call it, where you can watch, you can see, literally I've seen 5 or 6 wolves on one end of a carcass and 3 or 4 grizzlies on the other end of the carcass, and all the ravens and owls and seagulls and magpies, other birds of prey waiting their turn to swoop in and peck at the carcass. Yeah, that's one of the things I love about Montana. The carcasses at roadside, they never smell bad. They're frozen. And they get all pecked up and eaten by the time spring arrives, usually. And we get to watch that show, and that golden eagle in Paradise Valley is there still. I saw him this winter. So the bear feeding grounds that's a fabulous fertile field for writing and talk and thought. And Paul Schiller's written a wonderful book about it called The Bears of Yellowstone. Yes, sir.
How many original coaches are in existence, either, museums or private collections?
How many original coaches are in existence, either museums or private collections? You asked the question that I've pondered and tried to find out about for a very long time. The short answer is we don't know exactly. The longer, more interesting answer is that yes, there are some. The park holds a couple. The Museum of the Rockies has one. I saw a pretty good one at Cody at the Buffalo Bill, now called the Center of the West, there not long ago when I gave a talk over there. And it's a Yellowstone wagon, one of the YPT coaches that is yellow, painted yellow, and wheels are seats all face forward, unlike the old boxy previous stagecoaches. Those are out there. The Wiley Camping Company seems to not have very many left. Their coaches, by the way, were olive green and brown. Most of those coaches are gone for the Wiley Camping Company. The Studebaker Company, an old company who outfitted wagons for the Union Army during the Civil War and then made the transition to autos. The Studebaker Company outfitted the Shaw and Powell Camping Company, headquartered here in Livingston, and their coaches were a different color. They were not yellow, nor were they olive green or brown. They were what the company called aluminum, and it was a light blue, and the park owns one. And sure enough, the original paint is still on it. It's there, it's in the park collection. And then the fourth company, the Oneida and Yellowstone Stagecoach Company, their coaches were red. They were owned by F.J. Haynes, the park photographer, operated from 1898 to 1916. And today, the snow coaches from West Yellowstone celebrate that red from the west by being red. The yellow that came from the north, and that's, by the way, names of my chapters. Yellow coaches from the north, blah, 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 blah. Red coaches from the west, blah, 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 blah. But the yellow ones were the YPT coaches. The red ones were the Oneida and Yellowstone. The aluminum ones were the Studebaker Company, and the olive green and brown ones were the Wiley Camping Company. We don't know how many are out there. They're here and there, I run into them. The expert on that, by the way, is my compatriot Elizabeth Watry, who wrote the book Women in Wonderland. A great book, in my opinion, and it won the Willa Award for Best History Writing by a female author. The first book she ever wrote. It's a big deal. And her current project is the stagecoaches, but she's not telling the stories of the companies and the drivers like I am. She is attempting to find the answer to your question. Where are the coaches? What are their serial numbers? What are the wagon parts? How do they fit together? All of that stuff that the stagecoach aficionados just love. So, hard question to answer, but they're out there. Paul.
We have two of them at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum.
And there you go. Are they both YPT yellow ones?
YPT yellow, we have a 9-passenger, and we have a 5-passenger Yellowstone Western, which was Oneida Yellowstone.
And it's named, right?
Right.
I forgot to mention it.
The 5-passenger ones weren't named.
Okay.
By the Oneida.
So you don't have one of the original named ones, the big named
You
ones.
can see them at West Yellowstone.
Okay.
The thing also, so we have two of them, and another little quick thing, the Oneida Yellowstone, the F.J. Haynes named his coaches.
He did.
So the red snow coaches out of West all have names. The Yellowstone Park Company numbered their coaches, so all
Right.
the yellow coaches have numbers.
That's correct. Thanks for filling that in that detail.
And then 2 summers ago, the National Stagecoach and Freight Wagon Association held their annual at West Yellowstone, and they attempted to get as many coaches there as they could. Now, there weren't the ones out of the park because they're locked up. I believe we had 32 of them on display at West Yellowstone.
It was stunning. I was
From
there.
everywhere, including the only tally ho from Cozad, Nebraska, that brought it in a big trailer. It was amazing. And we had our 2 coaches over there. Cody had coaches and private coaches.
Lots of private coaches. There are hobbyists, aficionados that do this.
There should be
What's-
photos of that in Betsy's book.
Right, and what's the name of that outfit again? I never can remember the name of the club that does
I
that.
think it's the National Stagecoach and Freight Wagon Association.
That's it. National Stagecoach and Freight Wagon Association. Yeah, they're very interesting. Paul and I have both been to their conventions and spoke to them, and it's really interesting.
And, I have a board member, Jim Bluer, here in town, so that we may know him. He's restoring one right now. That came out of a barn that they didn't know about. Somebody had been sitting on it for years and years. So they
Yeah.
show up.
They do show up. But, you know, so many were left out in the weather, and they just deteriorated and went to nothing. They had to, in order to survive, they really had to be put at least indoors for some of it. I'm a fan, as you can probably tell. Any others?
How many people would go through in a season?
Oh my gosh. Okay, tourist records. How many visitors for Yellowstone? 10,000 in 1897. 500 in 1872. All through the 1870s when there were no roads. Everything was by horse or muleback. No real roads. 500 a year. 1880, about 2,000. 1883, when the railroad arrived on the Northern Pacific, here at Livingston, suddenly 5,000. That was a big year. That kicked Yellowstone into gear. Gradually increasing, except in 1894 and 3, when you had the panic of 1893, that's a Great Depression. Fell off like a stone. 1897, it recovered with 10,000 visitors. The statistics, if you're interested in them, are in Aubrey Haynes' book, The Yellowstone Story, Volume 2, page 478. You can go there and see on a year-by-year basis, up through when he, when he had his book published, what they were. I can remember, I can't quote you every year, of course, but 1 million visitors in 1948, 2 million in 1963, 3 million in, I want to say 1972-ish, the Park 100th anniversary. It is now 4.2 million, not like it used to be. You go to Yellowstone, as many of you know, many Livingston people avoid the park in the height of the summer. You're going to inch along in traffic, bumper to bumper. It's not like it used to be. So it's very crowded now, 4.2 million. So that's the statistics, numbers of visitors. I hope I
Yep, that's good.
got that question answered. But we have those statistics. Anybody else? Patricia.
Who's done all the research on the freight wagons? Could you talk about?
The freight wagons, the research is all split up. So Elizabeth Watry, I'm one of them.
I'm still trying to find out, because my grandfather had the liquor license, I
Right.
provided out Yellowstone with alcohol.
Right, the Graybow.
And it-
See, that was freight.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I just always wanted to find the,
yeah, that's gonna, I think you can find it in the archives. And I think I've told you that your grandfather, or is it great-grandfather?
no, my grandfather.
Your grandfather, Graybow, is in the Enterprise all through the 90s. I'm pretty sure I found him a couple times in the 80s. Today we can search. The newspapers are just fabulous now. I can't tell you, and for those of you who don't know it, the newspapers have become the historian's best friend today because they are now findable, searchable. It used to be that you would spend 20 years just researching one newspaper to find stuff, and now you can search from state to state, country to country, all over the world. It's like magic. And I spoke at the Montana Genealogical Association a while back and told them about it and how the things were turning up. And as I was talking, people were packing up and getting ready, listening to my directions as to how to get to these newspaper sites, and leaving while I was talking because they didn't want to waste any more time, because they wanted to go research. That's what happens when you really get hooked into something like Ancestry.com will do it for you, the genealogy, or the newspapers. And you go and search for your family in those newspapers, And that one, the free site that comes to mind is the Library of Congress's site, chroniclingamerica.com, no, .gov. chroniclingamerica.gov. Go on there and take a look, and you will see every state represented, all the newspapers, so many, and you can click on them, run a search for your family, wherever, whatever states, or all over, and you'll get 1 million hits probably, and then you'll have to narrow the search down to, one state or one town or something, and here they all are, and you click on it, and up pops the front pages of those papers. And while you're seeing your family members, you see President Garfield's assassination, or the hangings of the Lincoln killers. John Wilkes Booth shot in the barn. Mary Surratt, is that her name? I believe it was. Hanged. There they are in the newspapers, all that stuff. You'll get hung up just reading the side stories and the advertisements. Beware, you'll waste your time doing that, but it's all interesting. And I would see it when people would come to the library, in the archives at Yellowstone, and I would see people who hadn't started on it until they hit 45 or 50. And you could see the panic in their eyes. It was, and I would try to assuage them, make them feel better. It's okay, you're gonna have fun, it's gonna be great, you're gonna love it, but you can see the panic. I should have started when I was 20. There's so much to see, I wanna read it all. Oh my gosh. So beware, your wife or husband will divorce you. Beware of getting too hung up on it, but it is marvelous fun if you get into the newspapers and find the old accounts, because everybody went to Yellowstone from all 50 states and many other countries, and they all went back to their hometowns, and they all, many wrote accounts of their trips to Yellowstone. I'm finding them literally by the thousands, which is where a lot of this stuff comes from. Any other questions?
Hey, thank you, Lee.
Thanks for coming.